Arthur was 35 years old when this sequence of nightmares began, and it was also the first time he had ever set foot in Coachella. He and a companion named Marcus decided to seek out this desert valley to release their accumulated stress after exhausting their strength on a major project that had lasted for many months. The first 2 days truly felt like stepping through a spatial portal into a world that was entirely different and surreal. The surrounding atmosphere was overwhelming, with massive seas of people constantly surging, streams of thundering music that shook the chest radiating from every direction, and countless individuals clad in strange costumes screaming as if the world would end tomorrow. Everything initially brought a sense of being overloaded yet filled with excitement, causing both of them to sink into the illusion of absolute freedom. They fully enjoyed everything, immersing themselves in the passionate crowd and staying awake through the night under a desert sky brilliant with lights. However, when the third day arrived, exhaustion began to invade their every weary cell. It was a feeling of extreme fatigue gnawing at their muscles, yet their minds remained stubborn, unwilling to waste the final hours of their vacation. In a moment of hesitation between collapsing or continuing to force themselves, they made a fatal mistake. To force their bodies to maintain alertness amidst this madness, Marcus suggested they use a bit of a stimulant called Molly, and Arthur, in a moment of weakness, nodded in agreement. He was completely unaware that this small nod was the fateful key that swung wide the door to a rotting reality, where ghosts waited to step out from the darkness to slowly hollow out and utterly destroy his mind. About 1 hour after swallowing that tiny pill, the first changes began to softly gnaw at Arthur's perception. Initially, everything unfolded exactly as people often whispered regarding a perfect trip for those seeking pleasure. The heavy sensation in his calves and the depletion of energy seemed to evaporate completely, giving way to an unbelievable lightness, as if gravity had just released its hold on his body. The clusters of laser lights sweeping across the night sky suddenly became brilliant and unusually sharp, and every electronic note striking his eardrums was no longer just sound but became warm currents of electricity caressing every fiber of his flesh. Arthur smiled, merging into the undulating sea of people, feeling a strange connection with the thousands of strangers surrounding him. But that artificial light did not last long. Without any warning, the soft cocoon of illusion abruptly shattered, pushing him straight down into a pitch-black pit of panic. The surrounding space seemed distorted, and the laughing faces suddenly became deformed and blurred under the flashing lights of the giant stage. The air grew thick, giving Arthur the sensation of breathing under murky water, while his chest throbbed with frantic beats, so fast and strong that he imagined his heart was about to tear through his skin to escape. His throat was bone-dry, and his teeth clenched together unconsciously to the point that his jaw ached. It was precisely in that moment, as his vision was being shredded by garish and chaotic patches of color, that Arthur's eyes accidentally fell upon a completely out-of-place object. Amidst a forest of people dressed brilliantly, scantily, and covered in sparkling glitter as they whirled in a drunken stupor, that man appeared like a black tear upon the vibrant festival painting. He was about 40 years old, his angular face partially obscured by a scraggly, untrimmed beard, wearing a dark black shirt buttoned to the neck and heavy, old boots covered in dust. His appearance was so wrong and suffocating that it made Arthur's stomach churn. Initially, Arthur tried to convince his overloaded brain that it was merely a coincidence, and that among the tens of thousands of people here, seeing a strangely dressed man was perfectly normal. But that fragile comfort quickly vanished when he began to recognize a terrifying pattern. Regardless of which direction Arthur turned, whether he retreated, went to the drink area, or wove through the gaps between different music stages, his eyes always met that man in the black shirt. The man did nothing loud, he simply stood quietly about 20 paces away, his head slightly tilted, and his cold, sharp gaze pinned exactly onto Arthur's position like a predator patiently evaluating a weak prey. A chilling sensation ran down Arthur's spine, causing him to break into a cold sweat despite the fact that the desert temperature was not low. He turned to seek reassurance from Marcus, but his close friend was also drenched in sweat. His face pale, and he was constantly complaining about a thirst that burned his throat. The crowd at that moment was packed tight, jostling to the point of suffocation as if wanting to crush their chests. Marcus leaned in and shouted into Arthur's ear that he would go buy some bottles of water at a nearby refreshment stand and told Arthur to stand still and wait so they would not lose each other. Despite the intense insecurity clawing at his heart, Arthur nodded in agreement because his legs were now as soft as mud, and his head was spinning so much that he could not drag himself another step. The moment Marcus' back was swallowed by the frenzied crowd, a haunting loneliness immediately surrounded Arthur. He stood huddled among thousands of dancing people, feeling that his last layer of safety had completely collapsed. And then, the worst truly arrived. Only a few seconds after Marcus left, the rowdy layer of people in front of Arthur suddenly parted to reveal a gap. The man in the black shirt was no longer standing at a safe distance of 20 paces. He appeared looming right next to Arthur, as if a ghost had just risen from beneath the desert sand. No longer possessing his previous stillness, the man suddenly contorted his large body and began to dance in a mocking, crude, and ridiculous manner to the pulsing rhythm of the music, intentionally pressing his dangerous-smelling frame into Arthur's narrow personal space. The smell of sour sweat mixed with a strange, metallic, musty scent wafting from the man hit Arthur's nostrils directly, causing nausea to well up to his throat. The man tilted his head, bringing his grimy, bearded face close to Arthur's ear, his mouth curling into an eerie smile that made one's hair stand on end. Under the lights that flashed incessantly, the man's eyes did not have the lethargic, soulless look of those high on drugs. Rather, it was a completely sober gaze, murky with malice and overflowing with evil intent. He stared fixedly into the depths of Arthur's eyes, which were wide with utter horror, a cruel look as if silently declaring that this ruthless hunting game was only now truly beginning. The moment the man's grotesque smile brushed past his vision, a freezing draft of air ran down Arthur's spine, piercing through the sticky sweat on his skin. His survival instinct immediately screamed in his head, urging him to turn around. Instantly to find his only anchor at that moment. He fumbled, swinging his arms into the narrow void, his eyes searching frantically through every layer of undulating people, hoping to see the familiar silhouette of Marcus returning with 2 bottles of water. But the only response to his extreme panic was a sea of strangers, blurred faces distorted under the dazzling flashing lights, and no trace of his best friend. Marcus' sudden disappearance was like a sledgehammer blow to Arthur's mind, which was already as fragile as a thread. Just as his breathing began to fracture, the man in the black shirt tilted his head slightly to one side and pressed his grimy, bearded face against Arthur's ear. His voice rose in a deep rumble, not at all drowned out by the deafening music, but distinct in every word as it clawed at Arthur's eardrums, asking if he had lost his friend and offering to help find him. That seemingly kind offer carried a tone so cold, suspicious, and sinister that it made Arthur's stomach knot. The man had no intention of leaving, but instead pressed closer and closer, his murky eyes locked onto his prey, and eager anticipation etched onto his curling lips. Unable to endure another moment of suffocation, the horror exploded, shattering Arthur's final restraints. He brushed away the man's coarse arm that was about to reach out and used every ounce of his remaining strength to push through the crowd of dancing people to forge an escape path. With staggering steps treading upon plastic bottles and sinking desert sand, Arthur plunged forward like a madman, trying to escape the murderous aura behind him. However, his body had begun to react violently to that devilish pill. Side effects struck like a storm, leveling the little sobriety he had left. The world around him swayed violently, the ground beneath his feet seemed to crumble and constantly ripple, undulating without end and causing him to stagger repeatedly, nearly falling. His vision blurred, and the brilliant clusters of light from the stage now turned into eye-straining streaks of color, stretching long and winding through the air, and winning like glowing poisonous snakes. His ears rang, and the electronic music distorted into terrifying roars, mixed with the thumping sound of his heart bursting through his chest. Every physical form seemed to be melting, twisting into hideous shapes that besieged him. From all sides, a sensation of ultimate suffocation constricted his lungs, forcing Arthur to gasp for every breath of air mixed with the smell of smoke and dust. He continued to lunge forward, jostling through the thick crowd, ignoring the annoyed looks and the curses echoing in his ears. His throat was dry as if he had swallowed desert sand, and Arthur eventually found a sparse patch of grass at the outermost edge of the festival area, where the darkness seemed a bit quieter. He collapsed onto the cold ground in a state of panting, his hands tightly clutching his spinning, aching head. Sweat poured out as if he were bathing, soaking the back of his shirt, and he tremblingly thrust his hand into his pants pocket, pulling out his phone with fumbling hands he could not control. The phone screen was blurry and flickered before his eyes like a window looking out into another world, and the signal was so poor that the bars constantly danced and then disappeared entirely. Arthur bit his lip until it bled to try and focus, patiently calling Marcus' number time and time again, praying desperately for the other end to pick up. The first call failed completely. The second, third, and fourth calls all fell into a deathly silent void. The long, soulless ringing sounds were like blunt knives carving into his exhausted patience. It was not until the 10th call, when his last bit of hope was about to fade and the fear that the man would reappear to seize him rose to a peak, that Marcus' worried and intermittent voice finally rang out amidst the chaotic noise. Arthur nearly screamed into the phone, his voice broken and stuttering as he begged his friend to come get him immediately because something very terrible had just happened and his body could no longer hold on. The period of waiting for Marcus to find his location was perhaps only 15 minutes, but for Arthur's collapsing psyche, it felt as long as a century, every passing second dragging with it the sensation of thousands of murky eyes lurking in the surrounding darkness. As soon as Marcus' sweat-drenched figure appeared under the dim light, Arthur rushed forward and grabbed his friend's shirt, his eyes red and wild as he insisted they leave this godforsaken place immediately. Marcus was stunned for a moment by Arthur's haggard, pale appearance and his unconcealed extreme panic, yet he did not utter a single question or complaint. The fear clearly etched into every line of Arthur's face was enough to extinguish any intention of staying to continue the fun. Abandoning the top-tier performances that were still ongoing and leaving behind the passionate atmosphere that showed no signs of cooling, the two men dragged their heavy, weary steps through the crowd moving in the opposite direction. They gloomily rushed out of the ticket gates and fled from the desert valley in a state of extreme terror, walking quickly with heads down, only hoping to leave behind the ghost in the black shirt lurking somewhere in the dark crowd. The journey back to the rental house was extremely dark and felt interminably long, like a form of endless mental torture. Upon stepping inside, the silence of the house brought no sense of safety, but instead deepened the fear taking root in Arthur's mind. Both of them were completely exhausted. Arthur's physical form was so weary it overcame even his most basic needs. He did not bother to wash or change clothes but only staggered into his bedroom, letting the darkness surround him as he threw himself onto the mattress. The cruel remnants of the stimulant began to recede, leaving behind an empty, cold space that pushed him into a half-awake, half-dreaming state that was incredibly oppressive. He lost all concept of time, his body immersed in a fitful sleep filled with distorted images of the strange man. Then, suddenly, his eyes snapped open. There was no loud noise that woke him, no car horn or whistling wind, only a primal instinct whispering that a deadly danger was present. His heart suddenly throbbed incessantly. He slowly turned his head, directing his gaze toward the dark window, and then gradually shifted his vision to the slightly open bedroom door. At that exact moment, the blood in his veins seemed to freeze into ice. A tall figure, standing in absolute stillness, was looming right in the doorway, his face turned toward the bed where Arthur lay. Initially, his overloaded brain tried to protest, deceiving itself that it was perhaps only Marcus standing there to check if he was asleep. But the figure was too large, the shoulders too broad, and the chilling aura radiating from him absolutely did not belong to his best friend. Somehow, even though the darkness in the room was thick, Arthur's eyes still clearly captured the lines of that person's face. The man in the black shirt with the scraggly beard from the music festival was now standing right there in his house, only a few paces away. A horrific, freezing chill ran through his entire body, awakening every paralyzed nerve cell. Without thinking, Arthur used his last bit of strength to burst his chest open and let out a mournful, sharp scream that tore through the silent night. He screamed until his voice was hoarse, his hands frantically grabbing the thin blanket to cover his head completely like a child hiding from a monster under the bed. Marcus burst in from the room next door, hurriedly flipping the light switch and repeatedly calling his name. But when the artificial light illuminated every corner, the doorway was empty. There was no one there. Despite Marcus' efforts to comfort him, explaining repeatedly that it was only a terrible paranoid aftereffect caused by that godforsaken pill, Arthur could not close his eyes for another second. He forced Marcus to stay awake with him through the night with every light in the house turned on bright. The two men sat motionless until the first rays of a weak dawn pierced through the curtains. It was thought that the sunlight would dispel the worst nightmare of his life, but a shrill scream from Marcus in the hallway officially dealt a fatal blow to Arthur's last fragile hope. He staggered out of the room and saw his friend standing frozen, eyes staring fixedly at the light-colored wooden floor. There, a horrific truth extinguished all arguments about a bad hallucination and shattered every denial. Large boot prints, covered in dark mud and desert sand soaked with night dew, were imprinted very clearly on the floor. That eerie trail of footprints began at the main door, leisurely stretched along the narrow hallway, and then stopped in silence exactly at the threshold of Arthur's bedroom, at the precise spot where he had seen the man standing that night. After that deadly pause, the tips of the boots turned around, unhurriedly heading back toward the main door and disappearing. Arthur's stomach knotted violently, and a wave of nausea surged to his throat. Someone had truly broken into the house while they were asleep, stood there watching him in the darkness, and then quietly left. They frantically checked every entrance and searched every room, but no valuable items had been stolen. The intruder did not care for money. What he craved was perhaps the ultimate fear of his prey. Panic reached a peak, and without a word to one another, they frantically gathered all their clothes and stuffed them into suitcases, their hands and feet trembling uncontrollably. Leaving behind dozens of small belongings, they rushed to their rental car like those fleeing death itself, flooring the gas to race out of the quiet residential area. The escape from Coachella Valley took place in utter panic, the two men carrying a deep psychological wound that could not be healed, leaving behind in that parched desert a bone-chilling mystery and a ghost craving the hunt, still lurking somewhere within the passionate crowds. 1 full year passed since that horrific night in the deadly desert valley, and Arthur had used every possible way to bury that terrible memory in the deepest parts of his mind. He threw himself into work like a tireless machine, turning his days into a monotonous loop of only working and sleeping so as not to give his brain a single free moment to remember the figure of the man in the black shirt. However, the psychological trauma remained deeply rooted in his smallest habits, turning him into a paranoid individual who had to personally recheck the bedroom door locks dozens of times every night and who would jump at any small sound in the hallway. The only glimmer of light in Arthur's suffocating and extremely stressful life at that time was Elena, a gentle, warm girl with whom he had just begun a serious romantic relationship. She was like a sedative helping him temporarily forget the dark corners lurking around him. That when summer knocked on the door, Elena excitedly invited Arthur to fly to sun-drenched San Diego to meet her family. That offer initially felt like a death sentence to Arthur, because he had built a solid safety zone at home, and the thought of stepping out into the world to an entirely strange place made his stomach churn with fear. However, under the constant urging of his own parents, who were always worried seeing their son becoming increasingly withdrawn and withered, combined with the earnest look of expectation from Elena, Arthur had to grit his teeth and reluctantly nod in agreement. The flight across half the country felt like a long drawn-out torture, every minute in the air causing his chest to tighten with some invisible foreboding waiting to swallow him. Finally, as his weary feet stepped out into the noisy airport lobby, Elena and her father were waiting by a spacious family car, welcoming him with the warmest and most hospitable smiles. The car ride from the airport to Elena's family home went quite smoothly with light small talk, but Arthur's mind never stopped being vigilant, his eyes constantly glancing at the rearview mirror instinctively. They stopped in front of a magnificent and expensive beach vacation villa, a place filled with the sound of rustling waves and a breeze carrying the salty tang of the ocean. Elena's father enthusiastically helped Arthur with his heavy suitcase and personally escorted him down to his room. However, the moment he stepped into his private space, an invisible cold draft suddenly ran down Arthur's spine, sweeping away all the artificial peace he had just laboriously built. The guest room was positioned completely separately on the ground floor of the villa, isolated from the common living area and the bedrooms of other family members on the upper floors. Though the room was grandly decorated with giant glass windows offering a magnificent view of the white sand and the vast ocean, for someone with a deep psychological wound like Arthur, that emptiness was a deadly trap. Worse still, right outside his window was a solitary outdoor auxiliary staircase, connecting the ground and running straight up to the main entrance on the second floor. This strange architectural structure created a terrifying isolation, making Arthur feel as if he had been cast away in an exposed place with no protective barriers, where anyone from the dark beach could easily approach his room or step onto that staircase without anyone knowing. While silently unpacking his clothes and personal items from the suitcase, the rustling waves from outside did not bring a sense of relaxation. Instead, they sounded like horrific whispers warning him of a danger waiting to choke his chest in the night. The ghost of the man from the desert valley years ago suddenly rose up strongly, weaving through the folds of his brain, rekindling the fire of insecurity and utter panic that Arthur thought he had permanently extinguished, signaling a new series of horrific events about to strike his life once again. Just as he finished putting the last item in the closet, a gentle knock on the door interrupted Arthur's pensive thoughts. Elena appeared in a thin linen dress, her face radiant under the setting sun, excitedly inviting him to the beach to take a few commemorative photos. Despite the waves of nameless insecurity still surging in his heart, Arthur forced a strained smile, threw on a light shirt, and followed her. San Diego Beach at twilight was crowded to the point of being stifling. Groups of people walking, children screaming while building sandcastles, and couples strolling along the water's edge created a noisy scene that was a total contrast to the deadly silence he had felt in his room. Playing the role of the perfect boyfriend, Arthur held the phone, patiently clicking hundreds of times for Elena's various poses, trying to capture the golden sun as it sank below the horizon. After nearly an hour of exposing himself to the sea breeze, Elena was finally satisfied and signaled for him to stop. The two sat down on a nearby rock ledge to review their results together. Initially, everything was very normal, beautiful photos with Elena's sunny smile standing out against the backdrop of the sea. However, when Arthur's finger swiped to the 20th photo, a strange blockage at the corner of the screen caused his heart to stop suddenly. He frowned, bringing the phone close to his eyes to enlarge the image. A cold current of electricity flashed through his spinal cord, freezing all his senses in an instant. Far in the distance, hidden in the blurred crowd behind Alina's back, was a figure that he could never forget even if it were turned to ash. A man about 40 years old, with an angular face and a scraggly beard, wearing a dark black shirt buttoned to the neck and a hooded jacket that was completely out of place in the brilliant summer beach weather. Arthur tremblingly swiped to the next photo, then the one after that. His stomach knotted as if someone were using bare hands to squeeze every inch of his intestines. He was there, in every single picture. In the first photos, the man stood with his back turned, blending into the crowd. But as he swiped through the later photos, the distance between the man and Elena narrowed, and the man's posture changed in a bone-chilling way. He was no longer facing away but had turned his face completely toward the lens. And in the photo taken just 10 minutes prior, he stood only about 30 paces away, his murky, evil eyes staring through the phone screen, pinned directly into Arthur's eyes, which were wide with horror. The ghost from the Coachella desert 1 year ago had not vanished with the drug hallucinations. It had patiently followed him all this time, silently traveling thousands of miles to be present right at this beach. Arthur's breathing became rapid, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead despite the blowing sea wind. He looked up in a panic, his eyes frantically scanning the area where the man had stood in the final photo. But amidst the crowded sand being swallowed by the twilight darkness, the man had vanished completely without a trace, just as he had evaporated from Arthur's bedroom doorway years ago. Arthur's throat felt bitter, and he stuttered, his voice so shaky he could not form words properly, as he tried to hold the phone screen out to Elena to show her that demon. However, Elena only glanced at the screen and shrugged indifferently, assuming it was just some odd tourist who happened to be in the frame, and reproached him for spoiling the romantic atmosphere. Her light dismissal was like a bucket of freezing water splashed in Arthur's face, pulling him back to the harsh reality. He suddenly realized where he was. This was a vacation to meet his girlfriend's family, people who already had some reservations about his unstable psychological state and the nightly nightmares he had experienced. If he continued to scream, panic, or insist on the story of an invisible stalker now, they would surely consider him a madman, a weak man suffering from severe paranoia, unfit to protect their daughter. The instinct to protect his honor along with the pride of a grown man rose up, forcing Arthur to swallow his scream deep into his throat. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to suppress the tremor spreading through his muscles, and gripped the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. He gritted his teeth and stuffed it into his pocket, smiling a distorted smile and gently agreeing with Elena that perhaps his eyes were just dazzled by the sun. Both of them walked back to the villa as darkness completely enveloped the ocean. But throughout the walk, behind that seemingly perfect calm, deep within Arthur's mind was an ultimate horror silently gnawing at every neuron. He surreptitiously looked around, for he knew very well that this cruel hunting game had never ended, and this time, that demon was not just standing in the darkness targeting him alone, but his filthy eyes had begun to stalk the innocent people around him. That night, after finishing dinner in a strained atmosphere where Arthur had to exhaust himself playing the role of a cheerful guest, Elena excitedly pulled him back to the beach to join a bonfire party organized by her close friend. Darkness had completely swallowed all things by then, turning the vast ocean before them into a black monster, constantly growling through every wave crashing onto the cold shore. The sharp contrast between the warm, vibrant orange light from the flickering fire amidst the circle of laughing people and the thick, cold night surrounding them only served to multiply the insecurity in Arthur's heart. He sat huddled on a large piece of driftwood, hands tightly clutching a cup of beer that had gone cold, his eyes constantly scanning the hazy boundary between light and shadow where human vision was rendered completely ineffective. The noise of the crowd around him did not seem to reach his eardrums, as all of Arthur's senses were as tense as a wire to detect any abnormal sign hidden in that vast space. Exactly at 12 o'clock at night, as the sound of dry wood crackling mixed with the thumping music, the phone in Arthur's pocket suddenly vibrated, shattering the artificial shell of calm he had painstakingly worn for hours. The screen displayed an incoming call from his boss at work, a fairly easygoing man who frequently called to discuss small tasks or simply check in on his employees' vacations. To escape the boisterous noise of the excited crowd, Arthur stepped back a few paces, moving toward the water's edge where the light from the fire was only faint streaks shimmering on the damp sand. That he pressed the phone to his ear, trying to adjust his breathing and voice to sound calm as he told his boss about the long, tiring flight and the beautiful weather on the sun-drenched southern coast. However, in the middle of an unfinished sentence, Arthur's throat suddenly froze as if someone had poured a mass of molten lead into it. Less than 50 paces from him, right at the murky boundary where the white-capped waves licked the dark sand, a tall black figure stood looming, completely motionless and eerily silent. The person's dark coat blended into the deep night, but the sturdy silhouette, the standing posture with the head slightly tilted to one side, and especially the evil concentration radiating from that figure were absolutely unmistakable. The demon from the deadly desert valley, the mysterious man captured in the photos from earlier that afternoon, was now standing there in the flesh, letting the sharp sea winds blow through his coat, his eyes as if capable of piercing the thick night to pin down Arthur's widening face. Without any superfluous movement, he just stood silently like a statue carved from shadows, seemingly thoroughly enjoying the extreme panic that was slowly invading and eroding his weak prey's reason. Arthur's heart thudded in his chest so hard and fast that he imagined his boss on the other end of the line could hear it clearly. His boss noticed the sudden, abnormal silence and spoke up to ask if he was all right or having a problem. By a superhuman effort to surpass his own limits and suppress the scream of panic ready to explode, Arthur bit his lower lip until it bled with a pungent, metallic taste, forcing himself to look away and pretend he did not see the stalking ghost while hurriedly replying to his boss in a shaky, broken voice that he had just been startled by something harmless passing his vision. He clumsily made a strained excuse to hang up immediately, stuffing the phone into his pocket with hands that were shaking uncontrollably. The surrounding air suddenly became stifling and thick to the point of suffocation, and every sea breeze carrying the salty tang now also carried the stench of a dangerous stalking. At the same time, the bonfire party began to show signs of winding down, as the tired participants threw their leftover drinks into the dying embers and began calling for cars to return for rest. Knowing he did not have the courage to remain another second in that exposed and danger-surrounded place, Arthur turned and rushed toward Elena. Despite the fact that her family's grand villa was only a 2-minute drive from the beach and they could have leisurely walked home along the shore, Arthur was determined not to let that terrifying scenario happen. He rushed over and grabbed the hand of Elena's completely sober friend, desperately inventing a ridiculous excuse that Elena was so drunk she could not stand on her own feet, and begged her to start the car and take them home immediately. Elena opened her eyes wide, about to protest because she had actually only sipped a few mouthfuls of light beer, but when she caught Arthur's red, wild, and pleading eyes and felt his painful grip, she remained obediently silent as she climbed into the back seat of the car. The short road home passed slowly and with a tension that felt as long as a century submerged in a swamp. As soon as they stepped through the main door, Arthur used the excuse of needing an absolutely quiet space to care for his drunken girlfriend, resolutely guiding Elena up to her bedroom on the top floor and firmly refusing to step down to the exposed guest room on the ground floor. The ultimate fear deep in his heart about lying alone and solitary in a room with a giant glass window looking straight out onto the dark, stormy beach, where that bloodthirsty demon might be standing observing his every move, made every vertebrae of his back shiver with horror. That night, Arthur used trembling hands to lock several layers of the bedroom door, bolted every window latch, and lay huddled on a narrow sofa in Elena's room, his wide eyes fixed on the thick darkness until the first rays of dawn appeared, not daring to blink for even a short second for fear that the moment he closed them, that angular, bearded, evil face with the eerie smile would appear right before him again, that the dazzling light of the next morning piercing through the thin gaps in the curtains was not strong enough to dispel the gloomy cold still lingering deep in Arthur's blood after a sleepless night curled on the narrow sofa. When Alina's entire family woke and busily prepared for new plans on the sun-drenched beach, Arthur quickly made an excuse of a terrible nausea ravaging his stomach along with a pounding headache to ask permission to stay home and rest. He lied to them in an extremely tired tone, saying he only needed a full day of bed rest and would then regain the energy to fully participate in the rest of the vacation. Elena and her parents were kind-hearted people and did not suspect a thing. They affectionately gave him a few words of concern and then happily left the house, leaving Arthur alone in the vast space that began to sink into a spine-chilling silence. As soon as the main door closed, he gloomily dragged his heavy steps back down to the guest room on the ground floor, using trembling hands to bolt every lock from the inside and pulling shut the entire system of thick curtains to hide the giant glass panes, turning the room into a dark and isolated fortress. His body, weary from lack of sleep and his spirit exhausted after hours of extreme stress, caused Arthur to quickly collapse onto the bed, sinking into a deep, dream-filled sleep for an entire long day. When he groggily woke up, the digital clock on the nightstand showed exactly 7 o'clock in the evening. The sky outside the curtains had turned a gloomy deep blue, giving way to the darkness beginning to crawl through every corner of the vast beach. Just as his mind was still floating in a daze, a gentle knock on the door sounded along with Alina's soft voice. She informed him that the whole family would take the car straight into downtown San Diego for a grand dinner and then a walk through the city, expecting to return before midnight. Arthur only gave a faint grunt through the closed door, signaling for her to go enjoy the evening, and then held his breath listening to the footsteps receding on the stairs, the sound of the car engine starting, and finally the sound of tires rolling away until they vanished from the villa area. Now, he was completely solitary in the sprawling house, surrounded only by the monotonous, loud, and threatening sound of waves crashing on the shore. The absolute stillness combined with the dim light stretching across the room from the single night lamp slowly lulled Arthur back into a fitful sleep. But this time, the boundary between sleep and nightmare was quickly erased. He fell into an oppressive state of sleep paralysis, in which numerous rhythmic, rapid, and extremely insolent tapping sounds echoed in his ears, coming from a glass surface that was drawing closer. That clicking sound grew louder, repeating like sharp knives carving into his skull, cruelly torturing his eardrums until he could no longer endure another moment and jerked awake. Arthur's chest heaved violently like a bellows, and a cold sweat poured out, soaking the back of his shirt. However, the most horrific blow to his mind was that when he was completely awake and staring into the darkness, that malicious tapping sound did not disappear. It was not a residual hallucination from a dream, but a completely real, dry, and steady physical sound coming exactly from the floor-to-ceiling glass window of the very room where he lay. The blood in Arthur's entire vascular system seemed to freeze into icy blocks, every neuron tensing like a string about to snap. He stopped breathing, slowly and carefully turning his head on the soft mattress, directing his panic-filled gaze toward the curtain that was slightly parted by a tiny gap. There, through the thin gap of the curtain fabric, his heart seemed to stop as he saw the dark, tall, and sturdy silhouette of a man standing solitary right against the glass in the cold of the ocean night. At this time, he wore a dark hooded jacket pulled down to hide the upper half of his face, but his gaunt, evil eyes shone like a beast craving blood in the night, still pinned exactly onto Arthur's position through the glass. When he realized the weak prey inside had discovered his presence, the man did not startle or flee. On the contrary, the corners of his mouth slowly curled into a morbid smile that made one's hair stand on end. He slowly lifted a large arm encased in the dark sleeve up to eye level, then leisurely waved his coarse fingers back and forth rhythmically as if sending a friendly greeting from a hell reserved specifically for Arthur. The moment Arthur opened his mouth, unable to utter any cry for help because his entire larynx was completely paralyzed by ultimate fear, the man suddenly stopped his mocking waving motion that he turned abruptly, the ticks of his boots striking hard against the stone foundation outside, and he began to run madly along the open hallway. The sound of powerful and aggressive footsteps echoed clearly in the silent space, but what made Arthur nearly go numb and collapse was that the man was not running toward the beach to escape. He was charging straight up the wooden steps of the auxiliary staircase right against the wall of Arthur's room, the only path leading directly to the upper balcony and connecting to the main door of the grand villa. Only a single second passed before a horrific, piercing sound tore through the night. It was the sound of the metal lock of the heavy main door on the first floor being twisted and thrown open violently. The dry sound of the main door's hinges shrieking in the silent night was like a razor blade carving into Arthur's eardrums. His brain felt as if it would explode with thousands of questions screaming in silence, wondering how all the entrances were not locked and by what devilish way that man could so easily enter the villa as if it were a public place. Before the horror could subside, heavy footsteps encased in hard-soled boots began to stomp down each internal wooden stair leading directly to the ground floor. The thumping sound echoed and lingered, slow but powerful and carrying an intense murderous aura, getting closer and clearer until it stopped right on the other side of the thin wooden door separating Arthur's room from the outside world. A deathly silence enveloped the space for a moment, so stifling that Arthur could hear the blood rushing in his temples. Then suddenly, the metal door handle began to vibrate frantically and was twisted violently from the outside. The stranger threw the full weight of a sturdy body against the door, creating dull thuds that shook the entire wooden frame. Primal survival instinct rose up strongly, and Arthur, heedless of his trembling legs, lunged forward to use his entire body weight and firm shoulders to block the wooden panel, gritting his teeth to endure the terrifying shocks from the opposite side. The man outside seemed to grow increasingly enraged, the twisting of the door becoming more brutal with each passing moment, combined with heavy, gasping breaths that carried the intent to devour his prey. With one hand supporting the door that was about to burst its hinges, Arthur's other hand clumsily fumbled into his pocket to pull out his phone and quickly dial 911 to call the police with ultimate desperation. His voice was broken, whispering through his teeth as he begged for emergency rescue while the ghost outside was still focusing his strength on breaking the door. At that exact moment, all violent actions abruptly stopped. The door handle went limp. Eerie rustling sounds receded, and the space again sank into a hair-raising silence, with no sound of footsteps leaving or an exit door opening. Arthur maintained that desperate blocking position for 5 minutes that felt as long as a century, sweat pouring onto the floor, until the loud sound of a siren broke the silence and the frantic footsteps of the police force sounded from the main door upstairs. Only when he heard the authoritative voices of the uniformed officers announcing themselves did Arthur dare to release his body, which was stiff with fear, and with staggering steps he unlocked the door and lunged upstairs. Almost at the same time, the car of Alina's family rushed into the yard with the sound of tires screeching, and the whole family poured in with faces pale from worry. The police quickly searched every corner of the villa inside and out, but the black-clad demon had completely vanished into the vast beach night like an invisible ghost. While everyone was still reeling, not understanding what had just happened, a heart-wrenching scream from Elena rang out from her private bedroom at the end of the hallway. Arthur and the crowd rushed inside, and a sickening scene appeared, shattering any hope of a common break-in. The young girl's room was tossed about, with belongings scattered everywhere. Elena trembled, her face white, pointing toward a tiny security camera mounted on the corner of the ceiling which the police immediately took down for investigation. But what made Arthur's stomach turn and ignited a fury mixed with horror was the fact that the pervert did not bother to take any expensive jewelry or money. The only things he targeted and carefully took were Alina's pajamas, underwear, and a few thin swimsuits. In that moment, Arthur understood a harsh and bone-chilling truth, that this demon's goal was not limited to torturing his spirit, but his filthy hands had begun to reach out, touching and directly threatening the safety of those he loved most. 2 long and suffocating years passed since that horrific night at the sun-drenched beach, but the ghost of the past never released its hold on Arthur's tattered mind. The horror of an invisible stalker capable of breaking into every safest corner had transformed Arthur from a calm, confident man into a soulless shell who jumped at the slightest noise. Post-traumatic stress disorder had taken root in every neuron, causing him to repeatedly check every lock in the house dozens of times each night, surreptitiously install numerous dense security camera systems in every blind spot, and resolutely refuse to participate in any crowded social activities because of the constant sensation of thousands of murky eyes lurking about him. It was this extreme paranoia and bizarre behavior, always tense as a wire, that gradually eroded Alina's love and patience, pushing their good relationship to the very brink of complete collapse. Fiery arguments broke out more frequently than ever before, and tired tears rolled down Alina's cheeks as she felt utterly powerless to pull the man she loved from an invisible shadow that was gnawing at his soul day and night. Recognizing the danger of losing his only emotional support and the girl he loved most in the world, Arthur decided to yield and agreed to go on a long vacation with Alina to save and heal the deep rifts in their affection. They agreed to find a very quiet place, absolutely far from the bustle of busy urban areas or the crowded beaches that had left unhealable wounds. After many days of searching on online platforms, they booked a very modern and private rental house located completely separately on the outskirts of the resort city of Palm Springs. A car ride lasting many hours took the two of them further away, leaving behind the crowded and bustling residential areas, and heading deep into the place where golden sand began to dominate the lush vegetation and the grand houses grew sparse until they disappeared into the horizon. When the car stopped on the dry gravel yard, what hit Arthur's eyes was an architectural work of absolute minimalism, standing out amidst the desolate and silent landscape of the vast desert. The house had only a single ground floor, built squarely with cold, white-painted walls and clean, polished concrete floors. The most impressive feature of the building, and also the thing that immediately made Arthur's stomach knot with an invisible foreboding, was that the entire back of the house was fitted with giant transparent glass doors stretching from the floor to the ceiling. This luxurious design was intended to provide an unlimited view toward the large backyard and encompass the entire parched desert landscape in the distance, but for someone carrying an ultimate fear of being watched like Arthur, those giant glass panes were nothing more than a cruel display screen, exposing every activity of the people inside to a vast open space with no corner to hide or conceal one's identity. The backyard area was surrounded by a thin, flimsy wooden fence, and inside was a rectangular pool of clear, still water reflecting the harsh, dazzling sun, with a few white plastic lounge chairs neatly arranged by the poolside, and especially a tiny metal shed with a dull finish nestled modestly in a blind spot near the edge of the fence, where perhaps the owner kept pool cleaning equipment and gardening tools. Standing frozen in the sprawling living room, looking through the transparent glass at the silent desert space with only golden sand, parched bushes, and absolutely no sign of a neighbor or a passing vehicle, Arthur swallowed hard and tried to take a deep breath to soothe his heart, which was starting to beat erratically. He told himself that the absolute isolation of this place was the safest fortress on earth, and that no dangerous stranger could wander into such a desolate land without being detected from a great distance. However, deep in the dark corners of his subconscious, it was precisely that overwhelming emptiness and the lack of a safe hiding place in the giant glass wall system that was silently sowing the seeds of new panic, turning this desperate attempt to flee for peace into a deadly turning point where he was voluntarily surrendering himself to a perfect trap already set in the vast desert. Even though the giant glass windows and the desolate space gave Arthur a sensation of being overwhelmed to the point of breathlessness, the first day at the house in the Palm Springs desert passed strangely peacefully. They spent the entire afternoon driving into the town center for a cozy dinner, then returned home when it was pitch black to curl up on the sofa and watch a light-hearted comedy movie. The silent atmosphere and the complete absence of car horns or crowded crowd seemed to have a soothing effect on Alina's nerves, causing a smile to begin radiating on her lips again after many months of being submerged in stress. Even Arthur began to convince himself that perhaps he had been too suspicious, and that fleeing to this deserted place was indeed a right decision to cut off all traces of the past. However, that artificial cocoon of safety was quickly torn apart on the very first night. When the digital clock on the nightstand blinked to show exactly 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, amidst a space so quiet one could hear the blood flowing in one's veins, Arthur was suddenly awakened by a very strange sound. It was not the sound of thumping footsteps or the sharp crash of breaking glass, but only a very light thud, a dull sound coming from the wall outside the bedroom as if an object had just struck the cement surface. He lay stiff on the mattress, eyes wide and fixed on the dark ceiling, holding his breath to listen for the slightest movement outside. A few minutes passed in deathly silence, with no further sound. To soothe his accelerating heart and not wake Elena, who was sleeping soundly beside him, Arthur tried to rack his brain for the most logical explanations. He told himself that this parched desert region always suffered from extreme temperature changes between day and night, causing the building materials of the house to expand and contract and create normal physical noises, or perhaps it was just a desert wind accidentally blowing a dry branch against the wall. That forced rationalization temporarily calmed Arthur's nerves until the sun rose, but by the second day, things began to surpass the limits of normal physical explanations. In the afternoon, as the two of them were lying on the white plastic lounge chairs by the pool, enjoying the rare cool breeze blowing across the clear water, another chilling sound suddenly rang out. It sounded exactly like a human voice echoing from somewhere very far away amidst the vast white sand. The sound was not a complete sentence with normal intonation, but was drawn out and intermittent like a voice calling someone's name or a faint cry shredded by the desert wind. This time, Arthur was not the only one who heard it. Elena shivered slightly, lowered the magazine she was reading to her chest, and turned to ask him with a look of slight confusion if he had just heard someone calling. The fact that Elena also confirmed the existence of that ghostly sound made Arthur's spine go cold, for it completely crushed the fragile hope that everything was just a hallucination caused by his post-traumatic stress. Trying to hide the panic clawing at his heart to protect his girlfriend's bit of peace, Arthur forced a laugh and invented a reason that the sound was surely just the howling of coyotes that often scavenge in packs in these dry lands, or due to the open terrain magnifying noise from a highway dozens of miles away. Although he said this, the restlessness in his heart forced Arthur to stand up and approach the giant glass edge to scan the entire backyard and the vast sand in front of him. There was no sign of a living creature, no trace of tires or shifting scenery. Everything remained silent and desolate under the dazzling sun. The second night fell, bringing a stifling atmosphere and a tension that was many times greater. Strange sounds continued to appear sporadically throughout the time they lay awake in bed. This time it was not just single thuds, but mixed and were numerous clicking sounds, the sound of dry branches snapping, and eerie rustling noises as if someone were dragging heavy footsteps over the sand right outside the wall. Every sound that rose was another time Arthur's chest tightened, and he constantly gripped Alina's trembling hand, both of them lying perfectly still, desperately clinging to lies about the wind whistling through gaps and wild animals feeding at night to deceive themselves. They tried to use the silence of the desert to deny a horrific truth that was gradually becoming clear, that this desolate land was not protecting them, but was turning into a giant glass cage to lock in weak prey, creating perfect conditions for a patient predator to slowly close the circle in a thick night. That the third night fell over the Palm Springs desert, bringing a silent but thick and stifling atmosphere that felt as if it could choke the lungs of anyone unlucky enough to be trapped there. After 2 long nights of tossing and being tortured by invisible sounds, both Arthur and Elena were completely exhausted physically and mentally, and they decided to go to bed around 12 o'clock at night with the hope that fatigue would overcome fear. However, while Elena's breathing gradually became steady beside him, Arthur remained lying with eyes wide open, unconsciously scrolling his fingers over the phone screen, which emitted a cold, pale blue light. Exactly in that moment when the space was submerged in absolute stillness, a dazzling flash of white light suddenly tore through the thick night outside, slipping through the extremely thin gap between the 2 edges of the thick curtains and shining a sharp, long streak onto the opposite wall. Initially, Arthur's brain, as tense as a wire, tried to cling to the most logical explanation, telling himself that it was perhaps just the headlights of a car that had lost its way and swept across the yard. However, that harsh beam did not sweep by and vanish as usual. It remained brilliant and motionless. The insecurity surging in his stomach urged Arthur to gently throw off the blanket and sit up, tiptoeing his bare feet on the cold concrete floor toward the giant glass window. He used one finger to cautiously pull back the curtain edge, just enough for one eye to see through. Outside in the backyard, one of the motion sensor lights installed along the edge of the house wall was shining brightly, casting a pale white light that clearly illuminated the empty gravel yard. Arthur stood frozen in place, holding his breath and watching for about 20 long seconds, until the light suddenly went out, returning the space to its original pitch-black night. Arthur's heart had just barely loosened a beat when exactly 10 seconds later, a second motion sensor light located further along the side wall of the house suddenly flared up. A cold current like ice ran down Arthur's spine, and all the blood in his body seemed to freeze instantly as he realized a horrific truth, that the appearance of these beams of light was absolutely not a random short circuit or due to a small wild animal running by. It was clearly and slowly sketching the movement trajectory of a stranger with a body large enough to trigger the sensor system, a person who was leisurely walking step by step around the edge of the house. Arthur's trembling, whispered voice calling Elena's name woke her, and when she received his panicked answer that there seemed to be someone outside, she immediately jumped up like a spring. Both of them glued their eyes to the small curtain gap, terrified to witness the third light near the wooden fence area in the back continue to turn on, followed immediately by the fourth one near the pool edge. The stalker outside was not in a hurry. He moved rhythmically and leisurely as if performing a dance of shadow and light, intentionally letting the prey trapped inside this giant glass cage know clearly that he was present and was gradually closing the circle. Besieged by extreme horror, Elena began to sob but did not dare to make a loud sound. She used both hands to grip Arthur's arm, constantly begging him to drop the curtain, to hide every gap to escape the filthy eyes of the person walking out there. Arthur hurriedly did as his girlfriend asked, pulling the entire curtain system shut, turning the interior of the house into a sealed black box. However, the inability to see what was happening outside only multiplied the fear, as cruel imagination began to paint scenes of the man in the black shirt pressing his grimy, bearded face against the glass, seeking a way to break through this thin defense to rush inside. Unable to continue enduring this horrific psychological torture for another second, survival instinct and the pressure built to an extreme limit urged Arthur to make an incredibly reckless decision. That he turned to grab Elena's trembling shoulders, whispering decisively that he had to step out there to check what exactly was playing with their lives. Elena frantically clung to his shirt, shaking her head vigorously to discourage a foolish act of suicide, but Arthur gently removed her cold fingers. With steps as stealthy as a ghost, he circled through the kitchen area, pulling out a paring knife with the longest and sharpest blade from the wooden block on the counter. He hid that deadly weapon behind his back to avoid making Elena more distressed, then slowly approached the sliding glass door, his hand drenched in cold sweat as he gripped the metal lock, preparing to face the demon hiding in the endless desert night. Arthur slowly turned the cold metal lock, gently sliding the giant glass door aside to create a gap just enough to slip through. Unlike the artificial cool air from the house's air conditioning, the desert wind in the middle of the night hit his face with a bone-cutting cold and the musty smell of parched dust. The darkness outside was as thick as a layer of asphalt, swallowing every surrounding object when the sensor lights had temporarily gone out. Arthur's right hand gripped the handle of the paring knife hidden behind his back, his knuckles white from the strain, and cold sweat poured out to soak his palm despite the dropping temperature. He stood frozen on the porch for about a minute, holding his breath to listen for any rustling or footsteps in the silent space. That the silence of the desert at this time no longer meant peace, but was like the held breath of a giant monster before pouncing on its prey, stifling and tense to the point that his chest ached. When he detected no movement directly in front of him, Arthur took all his courage and began to take stealthy barefoot steps on the cold cement, moving slowly along the edge of the rectangular pool which was as still as a dark mirror reflecting the faint starlight. He tried to press his body against the house wall, eyes wide and scanning every blind spot, every parched bush, and every dark space under the lounge chairs. No one was there, the entire backyard seemed completely empty. A thin glimmer of hope flashed in Arthur's head, and he deceived himself that perhaps it was only a coyote or a large wild animal that had accidentally passed by and triggered the sensor lights, and now it had gone far away. However, when he cautiously stepped to the sand area near the side wooden fence, right under the position where the third sensor light had just been on, that tiny hope was immediately crushed to ash. Under the dim light reflecting from the living room curtain gap where Elena was still peeking, Arthur discovered in horror indentations clearly imprinted on the flat sand. Those were absolutely not the footprints of any animal. They were large boot prints, with soles that left deep, winding ruts, imprinted boldly and sharply as if they had just been made minutes ago. A chill ran from his heels up to the top of his head, and the blood in Arthur's entire body seemed to drain, causing him to stagger and nearly fall. Those footprints formed a long, purposeful trail, starting from outside the fence, heading straight into the yard, and the end point of that ghostly sequence lay right in front of him. They led directly to the closed door of the small metal shed located in the corner of the yard, where the pool cleaning equipment was kept. The last boot tip imprinted on the sand pointed straight toward the closed metal door, and there were absolutely no footprints turning back. This meant that the large stranger had entered and was currently still hiding right behind that thin layer of metal. In this moment, the fear was no longer shivering or vague foreboding, but had turned into ultimate dread, a harsh reality present in the flesh right before him. Arthur stood about 3 paces from the shed door, his body completely frozen like a plaster statue, and even blinking or breathing became extremely difficult. Stifling silence enveloped the entire space. He pointed the sharp knife tip forward, focusing all his attention on ears that were ringing with tension, trying to hear a gasp, the rustle of clothes, or any accidental movement from the narrow space of less than 4 square meters inside. 4 or 5 seconds passed like a century, and the inside of the shed remained perfectly silent with no sound, like a still tomb in the desert. But then, just as Arthur was about to retreat to run back into the house, a sound rang out that tore through the thick night and completely defeated his reason. Suddenly, from inside the shed, a man's voice rose, calm and mocking. He did not scream in anger or whisper a threat, but spoke in a distinct, leisurely, and polite tone that was morbid. That voice pierced through the thin metal, sounding clearly in Arthur's ear with a ghostly question, asking if he could please help open the door. And immediately after finishing the sentence, a small, rhythmic chuckle, echoing with evil and savagery, rose from behind the door, just like the way a hunter feels when seeing prey voluntarily walk into the deadly trap he has set. The mocking voice and the savage chuckle coming from inside the metal shed was like a sharp claw crushing the last bit of courage that had just kindled in Arthur's chest, making the paring knife in his hand useless and ridiculous before a seasoned predator who was leisurely enjoying the prey's fear. Not hesitating another fraction of a second, the survival instinct screaming in his mind forced him to turn and lunge toward the dim light of the living room curtain gap with the speed of a madman. His bare feet treading on the cold cement, he flew through the sliding glass door gap, used his full shoulder strength to slam it shut with a crashing sound that shook the frame, then frantically twisted the metal lock until his fingers bled. Elena was then huddled in the corner of the kitchen, her face white and bloodless, 2 rows of tears wetting her cheeks as she witnessed the tattered state and the extreme panic in her boyfriend's red eyes. Arthur rushed over and pulled the curtain shut, hiding the view from outside, then immediately pulled the mobile phone from his pants pocket, his hands trembling so much he dropped the device on the concrete floor twice before he could dial the 3 life-saving digits, 911. His voice was broken, whispering through gasping breaths as he begged the dispatcher to immediately send an armed patrol to the address of the deserted house because a very dangerous intruder was hiding right in the backyard. The period of waiting for the police siren to tear through the night was interminably long and felt like centuries in hell. The two of them gripped each other, huddled in a trembling mass behind the granite bar in the kitchen, not daring to turn on any more lights. The space inside was dark and stifling to the point of suffocation, while in the outside world, through the tiny gap at the curtain edge, Arthur discovered in horror that the motion sensor lights were still constantly blinking on and off without reason. The pale white light would occasionally flare up in one corner and then shift to another, sketching the chaotic trajectory of a ghost lingering and stalking around the giant glass cage, as if he were seeking a weakness to break through the thin shell to enter. Their endurance finally reached its maximum limit when red and blue lights flashed through the thick night, accompanied by the screeching brake sound of 2 police cars pulling up in front of the house. Several fully armed officers quickly spread out to surround the premises, while 2 others knocked on the door and announced themselves to bring Arthur and Elena out of hiding. Under the protection of the law enforcement, they cautiously stepped to the back porch. The police went straight to the metal shed, demanding the person inside surrender, but the only response was the deathly silence of the desert. A large officer used bolt cutters to snap the door lock and kicked open the metal door. Contrary to the expectation of a fiery encounter, the narrow space inside was completely empty. The person had mysteriously evaporated, merging into the vast darkness of the desert right before the police could seal the scene. However, what he left on the moldy wooden floor of the shed shattered any doubt about a hallucination. Scattered on the ground were a few empty water bottles, crumpled fast food wrappers, and an old, smelly blanket rolled up as a place to lie. That person had not just passed through, but had actually lived, ate, and slept right at this spot, separated from Arthur and Elena's bed by only a thin glass wall for the past few days. While Arthur was weak in the limbs at that bone-chilling evidence, another officer who was conducting a sweep of the entire interior to ensure no accomplices were hiding suddenly called him from the living room. The officer frowned, holding up an object encased in a transparent plastic bag for evidence collection. It was a faded black baseball cap, covered in dirt and yellowish stains that smelled of sour sweat. The officer asked if this was Arthur's item because they had just found it stuffed deep into a hidden gap behind the expensive sofa right in the middle of the living room. The moment Arthur's eyes met that wretched cap, a cold current like one from the underworld ran down his spine, freezing every drop of blood in his body. He stuttered in denial, shaking his head in ultimate horror, for neither he nor Elena owned or used any cap of such a filthy design. That cruel psychological twist dealt a fatal blow, crushing the last bit of reason in Arthur's head, for it proved a truth that the man in the black shirt was not just patiently camping outside the shed to observe them through the glass, but in some devious way, he had once nonchalantly stepped inside this very house, walked freely within their living space, stood right behind the sofa where they once curled up to watch movies in the evening, and perhaps he had silently stood there, watching them fall into sleep with a morbid smile they never knew existed. Immediately after the police force completed the brief scene report and left with a hollow promise to increase patrols, Arthur and Elena did not spend a single second hesitating to decide that they had to flee this cursed place immediately. The dread of the fact that the evil man had once leisurely walked right inside their living room made any effort to stay until morning meaningless and suicidal. Both of them rushed into the bedroom like madmen, grabbing all their clothes and belongings and stuffing them into suitcases in a very chaotic way, their hands and feet fumbling and trembling incessantly. While Elena was sobbing trying to zip the last bag, Arthur hurriedly pulled out his phone, fingers trembling as he typed urgent messages to the rental owner through the online application. He described the entire horrific event that had just occurred, about the intruder in the shed and especially the filthy, horrific cap hidden right behind the sofa. The phone screen clearly showed the messages had been read, but Arthur's panicked wait was only met with a deafening silence. There was not a single call back to ask about the guest's safety, not an explanation, nor any astonishment sent. That indifferent and bone-chilling silence stabbed a deep wound of extreme paranoia into Arthur's crumbling mind. Did the vanished owner have a direct connection to that stalker? Did he intentionally provide the door code for that demon to slip into the house? Or even more horrific, were the owner and the man in the black shirt actually the same person playing a morbid game of cat and mouse? That terrifying thought choked Arthur's lungs, and he loudly urged Elena to carry the luggage and rush to the car parked solitarily in the yard, throwing everything into the trunk and hurriedly flooring the gas to race into the thick desert night, leaving behind the giant glass house sinking into an eerie stillness. The atmosphere inside the car was then stifling and thick as if all survival oxygen had been drained. The faint light from the center console reflected on Elena's white, haggard face. She sat huddled in the passenger seat, hands gripping her chest and constantly sobbing mournful, strangled cries, her soulless eyes filled with horror and fixed on the dark, misty space in front of the car. Arthur gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles ached, his eyes constantly glancing at the rearview mirror with ultimate fear that he would see two red lights of some strange car silently following them on this endless deserted road. The sound of the car engine roaring tore through the parched night but could not fill the desolate, cracking void inside his soul. Arthur's tired brain began to chain together all the horrific events that had struck him over the past 3 long years, starting from the chaotic music festival in the dusty valley, continuing to the breezy beach villa of Elena's family, and peaking at this isolated glass house in the desert. A harsh and icy truth gradually took shape, crushing any thin hope of a coincidence. That man in the black shirt was absolutely not a ghost who accidentally passed through his life, but he was a bloodthirsty parasite, a toxic curse that had taken root deep in his very being. Regardless of where Arthur fled, how much money he spent changing locks, or how well he hid behind many layers of secure fencing, he was still forever a brilliant lighthouse emitting a light of desperation to attract that demon to his scent. His stomach knotted with pain as his grieving eyes, filled with regret, accidentally touched the weak, trembling figure of the girl he loved most sitting right beside him. Elena was completely innocent. She had possessed a radiant and peaceful life before becoming involved in this tiring love with him, but now, his very presence was personally turning her into a target for the brutal play of a person with a twisted psyche. The deep love and desire to protect that Arthur had for her were now the most dangerous and fatal weapons that could take her life at any time. In the cold car drifting aimlessly through the dark night, a most cruel and bloody decision began to form in the tired man's mind. Even though his heart was being shredded by thousands of glass shards, even though the prospect of living the rest of his life in ultimate solitude and inescapable paranoia made him want to choke, Arthur understood clearly that the only way to ensure absolute safety for Elena, The only way to release that poor girl from these days of living in extreme terror was for him to actively let go of her hand. He had to grit his teeth and cut off all contact, embrace this gloomy and deadly curse, and walk alone into the darkness, taking the monster that craved the decay of his soul away from the trajectory of that radiant girl's life forever. Returning to the current timeline, Arthur now sits alone in a cramped apartment in a strange city, where the curtains are always drawn tight day and night and numerous heavy steel locks are reinforced on the main door. The decision to leave Elena years ago is a wound that will never close, but it was the only sacrifice to protect the woman he loved from the claws of the invisible demon. In sleepless nights spent with sedatives and bitter cups of coffee, Arthur has countless times reanalyzed that entire series of horrific events to try and understand the twisted psyche of the stalker. He realized a harsh truth that the man in the black shirt never intended to rob property or kill him quickly. What that monster actually craved and enjoyed was the cruel game of mental torture, the morbid pleasure of seeing his prey writhe in ultimate fear, slowly losing reason and all trust in the safety of the surrounding world. Despite changing his residence countless times, post-traumatic stress disorder still binds Arthur to an invisible prison, forcing him to constantly check every corner, every gap, and jump in alarm at any slightest shift of furniture in the house. Just as Arthur finished these tired thoughts and was about to collapse his head onto the table to find fitful sleep, from the dark hallway of the current apartment building, an extremely small but bone-chilling rubbing sound suddenly rose, followed by the sound of heavy boots slowly approaching his doorstep, like a whisper from death implying that this nightmare has never and will never truly end.